Sylvia, stick around for this conversation. Let's bring in Carsten Brzeski now. He is Global Head of Macro at ING. He joins us live from Berlin. And Carsten, looking at the expectations here, odds are firming up for a 75 basis point hike. I guess you could say the ING house view, though, is for a 50 basis point hike. Why is a more dovish approach warranted right now?
Yeah, I don't know whether it's warranted. It's more that, when you dive into the psychology at the ECB, it's always a compromise. And I find it hard to see how 75 basis points could be a compromise for the ECB. To remember that Philip Lane had been also out there somehow, slowing down the expectations triggered by the hawks, calling for a more measured and a more gradual approach. And back in July, I think, for the doves, they got the transmission protection instrument. You could say that's what they received in favor of handing in the 50 basis points. But this time around, I cannot see anything that the doves would receive for agreeing to 75 basis points. This is why I think the compromise solution will be 50 basis points and then another probably 50 basis points in October.
Okay, so Carsten, what would your 50 basis point hike mean for the euro, which is already being battered and bruised by King Dollar and the energy crisis, which continues to unfold across the eurozone?
Yeah, for the dollar, obviously, also given what is currently priced in markets, namely 75 basis points, it would be bad news. So we will probably see another weakening of the euro then in the minutes and hours after the decision. For the energy crisis and the looming recession, it wouldn't do anything. But here, I think it doesn't matter whether we have 50 or 75 basis points. We are heading or we're sliding into a winter recession. The energy crisis is so severe that there is no way that we can avoid this recession. And I also don't think, normally, and that's what central bankers have forgotten, normally there is a time lag between central bank action and when it really shows up and appears in the real economy. And this time lag is at least 6 to 9 months. So anything that the ECB does today or in the coming weeks won't do anything to either make the recession worse or stop the recession.
Let me ask you about the labor market, because I've seen some comment for the dovish side suggesting that they're not seeing enough action in terms of wage pressures to really justify a 75 basis point hike. Can you tell us what you're seeing there in terms of dynamics in the wage market and how that could impact this rate hike?
Yeah, that's correct, Sylvia. There hardly is any pressure in the labor market. Yes, we do have a lack of qualified workers. But when you look at recent wage growth numbers, I think they were at 2.8% in the Eurozone. So this is clearly nothing that should bring sleepless nights to the ECB. And when we're now really moving into a recession, when we might see more, in addition, furlough schemes coming up in the Eurozone labor market, this would also kind of slow down the negotiation power that unions have in order to go for higher wages. So currently, there is no sign of a price wage spiral in the Eurozone. And this argues for the more measured, more gradual approach of normalization of monetary policy.
Now, a recent change in terms of ECB policy has been to essentially put aside the forward guidance. But tell us what you expect in terms of communication from the ECB and what are you expecting from the period between today and the end of the year?
Yeah, I think you're right. So forward guidance is over. I think you could even go as far as saying that inflation targeting is over, because listening to the ECB and also listening to the Fed, it seems as if the major central banks are currently no longer focusing on inflation projections, inflation targeting, but rather on actual inflation numbers, which is something that you never would read in an economics textbook, to be clear. So therefore, I think we will see that there will hardly be any communication that they will stick the ECB to this meeting by meeting approach, the MBM approach. So no forward guidance until the end of the year. I expect the ECB to hike again in October, so by 50 or 25 basis points. And then I think they will go for a pause. Why is that? Because then the recession will be too severe for the ECB continuing to hike. I think it's one thing hiking going into a recession, but I cannot see the ECB continuing to hike throughout a recession.
Carsten, just to pick up on that point, winter is coming, right? Literally and metaphorically. So how deep and how long would any winter recession be in your view?
Then in the end, it depends on how governments will react. So we will at least have this price effect from higher gas prices, higher oil prices, higher energy prices in general. This will, as of October, really start denting private consumption, as this is the moment when many households will be presented the higher invoices. It is also putting an enormous burden on businesses. So this would be a severe recession. We currently have penciled in 3 consecutive quarters of contraction. How severe it will be, whether it's going to leave marks on the labor market, all depends on government. And here, just to give you a comparison, during the pandemic, Eurozone governments spent between 10 to 15% of GDP on fiscal stimulus. Currently, we're talking about something like 2 to 3% of GDP. So if governments step up their support measures, and they can, supporting businesses, supporting the labor market, then the recession will be less severe. If we stick to the current size of the fiscal stimulus, I'm a bit afraid that the recession will become more severe.